So remember, you know, we are in chapter 4 and we're talking about tissues. So I just want to do a quick recap of the tissues we've talked about, and then we'll go over any questions that you have. Okay, so remember, there are 4 different kinds of tissues. There is epithelial tissue. Can you all see that when I'm writing?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So remember, epithelium is a covering or a lining. And it can also make up our glands. And so we walked through different kinds of epithelial tissue. On Monday, we talked about how we name our epithelium, how we name it. The first name always tells you the number of layers that are present. So remember, it's simple or stratified. And then the second name tells you the shape of the cells. Right? And so we walked through different kinds of epithelial tissue. We walked through all the simple types of epithelium, like simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. We also talked about a pseudostratified epithelium that kind of looks stratified, but it's really only one layer. And then we walked through our stratified epithelium. Okay. We also talked a little bit about glands on Monday as well. So we walked through different kinds of glands, like merocrine glands and holocrine glands, and the difference between those, which truly is their function, how they're secreting. And then we left off talking about, I just write CT, which is connective tissue. And remember, connective tissue connects and it gives support. And our main types of connective tissues are connective tissue proper. These are things like tendons and ligaments, cartilage, bone, and blood. And so we left off on Monday, kind of here in connective tissue proper. We left off talking about loose connective tissue propers. Because remember, these types of connective tissues, we can kind of classify them as loose, or we can classify them as dense. And it truly just means how compacted everything is within that tissue. All right, so did that jog anybody's memory? Does anybody have any questions that you can think of about our connective tissues or our epithelial tissues? Everybody okay? Okay, so today we'll pick up with our connective tissues. I mentioned that we kind of left off in our loose connective tissue. And so here we are, you can see, let me go back one slide. We left off here, we were talking about adipose tissue, fat tissue, and how we have white fat and we have brown fat. White fat is mostly in adults, and brown fat we find mostly in babies. And then another type of loose connective tissue is reticular connective tissue. And this one really gets its name. I'm going to try to write on this board, but I don't know if y'all will be able to see it on your screen. So we'll give this a shot. Does that show up on your screen? I don't think so. What I just underlined up here, can you see any of that?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, darn. Okay, I'll just write on the monitor. Thank you. All right, so reticular connective tissue gets its name because of the type of fiber that we have. And so it has, remember we have collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. So this one gets its name because it has a lot of reticular fibers. These are fibers that are similar to collagen fibers. Remember, collagen are the ones that are stronger than steel. So these are kind of similar to collagen fibers. They're a little more delicate. Okay? They're not quite as tough as collagen. And remember, when we're dealing with a connective tissue proper, it's always going to be a type of cell called a fibroblast. And so a lot of times we have fibroblasts in our reticular connective tissue, but sometimes we just call them reticular cells. I'll call them fibroblasts. The only time I'll differ from when we're doing a connective tissue proper, the only time I'll call it the cell something different from fibroblast is when we talk about adipose tissue. That's when I call them adipose sites. Okay. All the other connective tissue propers are just fibroblasts. Just makes it easier. So where do we find this reticular connective tissue? We're going to find it in organs that sort of have like a soft internal skeleton. They have to have a lot of structure. So some great examples are things like the spleen, even in your bone marrow. Your bone marrow, remember, is found inside your bones, inside the hollow spaces of your bones. And that has a lot of loose connective tissue, this reticular connective tissue in it. So here's a picture. This is of the spleen. And so you can see in black, these sort of black strings that are thick. Those are reticular fibers. And then you can see those fibroblasts. You can see the fibroblast nuclei. You can also see some white blood cells in there. So I'm going to skip back and just walk through a couple of these tissues that we did already, just to show you the difference between a reticular fiber. And let's go back to this one. These real skinny black ones here, remember, those are elastic fibers. So if they look like a piece of hair, it's an elastic fiber. If it's thicker and really dark, like these, it's reticular fibers. Okay. So those are our loose connective tissue propers. We also have dense connective tissue proper. I can do that. Let's see. Hang on. I got to get that off the board. It's driving me nuts. Okay. So dense connective tissue proper is when the connective tissue is really dense and jam-packed in there. So we have two kinds. We have dense regular and dense irregular. So the term here that we're looking at is regular. So this is a tissue that's very compact, and all of the fibers in this dense regular connective tissue are very parallel. So they're regularly arranged. And dense regular connective tissue has a ton of collagen fibers in it. And so collagen fibers, remember, these are the ones that are stronger than steel. They're usually thick and they're usually pink in color. And so because they're really, really tough, they can withstand a lot of tension. But again, think about this. We're looking at fibers that are all running in the same direction. So the tension that this tissue can withstand is from one direction, being pulled in one direction. Again, we're still looking at connective tissue proper, so we still have fibroblasts. And where we find dense, regular connective tissue is going to be in things like tendons and ligaments. Again, if you think of a tendon, it's being pulled in one direction as that muscle contracts and pulls on the bone. So here's a great example, right? So we're looking here at some ligaments and tendons. And so you can see like this tendon right here. Ooh, I don't know what happened to that. Okay, and see that tendon right there? It is going to withstand tension in just that one direction as it's being pulled. And if we look at this fiber, the fibers in this tissue, notice how they're all in this one direction. So this is why we call it dense, regular connective tissue. All the fibers are running in the same direction. It's nice and pretty. They're all parallel. You can see those fibroblasts, the nuclei in there as well. And then the other kind of dense connective tissue is dense irregular. And this one gets its name because the fibers are irregularly arranged. They're arranged almost in like a hodgepodge. So they're kind of all over the place, running in different directions. Still collagen fibers, so they're still stronger than steel. They're really tough. But now think about it. You've got collagen fibers running in all different directions. So now you have a tissue that can withstand tension from lots of different directions. So where we find this is going to be in places like in your skin, not the top layer of your skin. The top layer is epithelial tissue, but just under that layer is called the dermis. And the dermis has some dense, irregular connective tissue in it so that it can withstand tension from lots of directions. Think about your skin and how often it's getting pulled in different directions, not just from moving and bending, but even from growth, from weight gain, from pregnancy. Your skin is being stretched in different directions. So this is a tissue that is really tough, can withstand tension from lots of directions, but it's not foolproof. It can tear. If you put too much tension on this tissue too quickly, it'll tear. And we see this in our body as stretch marks, right? And think about what causes stretch marks. It's going to be things like growth spurts, when you hit a really fast growth spurt, or pregnancy. You know, some women, when they get pregnant, I have a friend who gained 100 pounds when she was pregnant. And 100 pounds in 9 months is a lot of weight to gain. So you're going to get those stretch marks, which shows that tearing. So this is an example. This is actually, this is not part of the skin here. This is not the dermis. This is showing you dense irregular in a joint capsule. And so again, if you think about the capsules around your joints, they also have to withstand tension from lots of directions. And if you look at this tissue, first you're going to notice it's collagen fibers, right? Because they are thick and pink in color. And that's usually what we find. And then when you see these collagen fibers, they're not nice and regularly arranged. They are in a hodgepodge. So they're kind of all over the place. And you can also see those nuclei from the fibroblasts in there. All right, so if we just kind of flip between this one, dense irregular, and there's dense regular, you should be able to very quickly see the difference between those two. One is regularly arranged, nice and parallel, and one looks more messy, looks like a hodgepodge. Okay, so those are our types of connective tissue proper. So again, remember, we have our loose connective tissue proper and our dense connective tissue proper. Okay. Now another kind of connective tissue, so remember we have connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. So another kind of connective tissue is cartilage. And we have lots of different kinds of cartilage, 3 different kinds. Cartilage is sort of in between connective tissue, like a dense connective tissue, and bone. So it's really tough, like a dense connective tissue, but it's just not quite as hard as bone. So it's sort of in between the two. Cartilage does not have any nerves, and it does not have a blood supply. Remember, A means not, so it is not vascular. So it's really important for cartilage, if it has no blood supply, remember it still has cells in there. The cells have to get nutrients. So it's really important that cartilage is getting a good blood supply and nutrients from surrounding tissues. So we actually have tissue that surrounds your cartilage that feeds it and makes sure that it gets some nutrients. There is a lot of fluid in your cartilage, and that's really important because the extra fluid in cartilage helps your cartilage rebound once it's been compressed. So think of like the meniscus in the knee, right? It has a lot of fluid in there so that as you're running and jumping, it is getting compressed, but it'll rebound. Now remember, the type of cells that are in cartilage are chondroblasts if they're immature, and chondrocytes if they're mature. So remember, when we're talking about connective tissues, I mentioned this on Monday, it always, typically except blood, follows the blast site rule. We have an immature cell, and then once they've created the tissue, they become the mature cell, the site. Now, one thing I want to point out that's different with very tough tissues like cartilage and bone, these are the only things that we'll find in cartilage and bone, is that because these tissues are more tough, a lot of times what'll happen is like a chondroblast, a little cell, it will make the cartilage. And as it makes the cartilage, it kind of puts it all around itself. And then it is stuck in a hole. It's kind of like if you mop your floor, sometimes you mop yourself into the corner and you're like, well, crap, now I'm stuck. So chondroblasts can create cartilage all the way around themselves, and then they're stuck in a hole. And that hole is called a lacuna. And so anytime we're dealing with a tissue that's tough, like cartilage or bone, the cells will be found in lacuna. So a chondroblast is going to make the cartilage, and it creates a little lacuna for itself. And once it is in that lacuna, we now call it a chondrocyte. Okay. So I'm going to walk you through our three kinds of cartilage. The first type of cartilage is called hyaline cartilage. And the term hyaline just means glassy. So this one, you know, under a microscope, this is one of my favorite tissues to look at because it's super pretty. It has this sort of glassy background, this appearance that's really sort of a translucent purpley pink kind of color. And the type of fiber is going to be a collagen fiber, but in reality, you don't really see those fibers. They're sort of blended together. They're not very apparent because the background looks really glassy. Again, we're talking about cartilage, so no longer are we looking at connective tissue proper, which has fibroblasts. Now we're looking at cartilage, which has these chondroblasts or chondrocytes in lacuna. Now I want to point this out. If you notice how they spelled lacuna here, or how I've spelled lacuna, I added an E on the end. And you'll see this a lot in anatomy. Sometimes when we try to make things plural, if it ends in A, you can't add an S on it to make it plural. Instead, you add an E to the end to make it plural. So this is just plural, lacuna or lacunae. Okay, lacunae is plural. So hyaline cartilage is actually the most abundant cartilage that we have in the body. Where we're going to find it is at the ends of all of our bones in the body. And it's truly there to sort of keep your bones from rubbing on each other as you're moving. It protects the ends of your bones. It absorbs shock. It reduces friction. The other place where we might find this is in an embryo. So in a developing embryo, before bones form, bones in an embryo do not form until about the 2nd month of gestation. And before that, you actually have placeholders made of hyaline cartilage. So we have something called a pre-skeleton in an embryo that's just a cartilage skeleton that bone will then eventually take over. So this is a great example of hyaline cartilage. We find hyaline cartilage in the sternum, in that bony thorax connecting the ribs to the sternum. So you can see in pink here. That is what we call our costal cartilage. And so if we look at this microscopic picture of hyaline cartilage, it's super pretty. So you can see that the collagen fibers in the back aren't very apparent. It looks kind of purpley, pinky back there. So we don't really see the collagen fibers, but you can see the chondrocytes in lacuna. And notice how those cells look different. So you can see the nuclei of the cell And notice that it is in this sort of hole. So that's the chondrocyte in the lacuna. And again, that's going to be in any tissue that's really tough, like cartilage or bone. You'll find lacuna. Another type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. This one's really similar to hyaline cartilage, but it has a lot of elastic fibers in it. Remember, elastic fibers are really thin and dark in color. They almost look like hair under the microscope. And they're just like rubber bands. So they're going to provide a different characteristic to elastic cartilage, and it's going to give it a lot more flexibility. So we're going to find this anywhere we need more stretchability. Again, we're still looking with chondrocytes and lacuna because we're talking about cartilage. So where would we find this? This would be in anywhere in the body where you have a little more flexibility, but you still have cartilage. So this right here, your ear, right? Your ear is really flexible. We call that the pinna, and that is cartilage, but the type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. We also have it in places like the epiglottis. Does anybody know what the epiglottis is? Have you heard of that before? It is, you have two tubes in your throat. You have one that carries air, that's called the trachea, and you have one that carries food called the esophagus. Because both of those tubes come up to the back of your throat, it is really important that the correct substance goes down the correct tube, right? Like for example, if you swallow food, the last thing you want is for that food to go down your trachea, to go down your windpipe. We call that aspirating food. People die from that, right? So you have at the top of your trachea, you have a little structure made of elastic cartilage called the epiglottis. And it's a little flap, it's very flexible. And when you swallow, it instantly closes over the trachea. It closes your windpipe. So the only tube that food can go down is the esophagus. So you can try, like if you swallow your spit, notice if you're swallowing, you cannot breathe in at the same time. And that's because of your epiglottis closing over that trachea, okay? So sometimes we call it the guardian of the airways. So here's a picture of elastic cartilage. This is from the pinna, from the ear. And notice when we look at this one, the thing that I think makes this really easy to identify is all of these elastic fibers, right? These little skinny black fibers that look like hairs. Now you know you're dealing with elastic cartilage. And you can see these chondrocytes in lacuna, in those holes. And our last type of cartilage, our third type of cartilage, is called fibrocartilage. This is really similar to hyaline cartilage. It's not quite as thick, not as firm, but it does have nice thick collagen fibers in it. Still chondrocytes in lacuna. We're talking about cartilage. And we're going to find fibrocartilage anywhere where we need to withstand a lot of pressure. So this would be in places like the intervertebral discs. So I'll wheel a skeleton up here. I don't know if y'all can see it if I pull it up here. But the intervertebral discs are just between the vertebrae here. So all these little discs between the vertebrae, think about how much pressure is on your back. It's a lot of pressure. All of your body weight basically is carried in your back. And so that's a lot of pressure. So that's going to be fibrocartilage in those discs. Also in the knee joint, right? The meniscus of the knee is made of fibrocartilage because of all the pressure from standing. That basically your knees carry the entire weight of your upper body. This is the only time where you're going to see collagen fibers that are pink in color. A lot of times when we look at fibrocartilage under the microscope, the collagen fibers are actually stained a really light blue color. Oops. So that's the only time that I'm aware of that we're going to see something like that. Okay, so collagen fibers here, you can see there are these fibers running around and they're that light blue color. And you can also see really well, you can see these chondrocytes, the nuclei of the chondrocyte in the lacuna, so in that little round space. So we have gone through connective tissue proper, we have gone through cartilage, now we're going to do bone and then we'll do blood. So bone is, another term for bone is osseous tissue. And bone is different because the matrix inside the bone has been calcified. Anytime a tissue has been calcified, it becomes really hard and rigid. Calcium makes your bone really hard. And so in our bone, we have calcium salts. Now, you know, your bone will store calcium. In reality, our bodies need calcium for every physiological function that's happening in our body. For example, we need calcium for our muscles to contract. Physiologically, we need calcium for nerves to fire. We need calcium for glands to secrete, for cells to be able to divide. We need calcium for everything. So your body will always maintain a certain amount of calcium in your blood. And if there's ever a time where your blood calcium level is elevated, if it's high, your body will take the extra calcium that you have in your blood and store it in your bones. And the benefit of that is it makes your bones even stronger and harder, right? Now, the downside is that if there's ever a time in your life, and ladies, this happens to us when we go through menopause, when we lose the protective effects of estrogen, and we're no longer making estrogen, a lot of times what can happen is our blood calcium level can get low. But remember, we need calcium for everything. So our body goes, I need calcium and I need it fast. So your body's gonna pull that calcium out of your bones. It's gonna leach it from the bones. Now the downside is that it's gonna make your bones more brittle, right? They're gonna be softer because they're gonna have less calcium. And we know that calcium makes your bones hard. So if we lose the calcium out of our bones, it's not great for our bones, but it is a way for us to get the calcium back in our bloodstream so that all of our physiological functions can continue to work. So your body looks at your bones as a place to store calcium. And the benefit is it makes your bones hard. Now the type of cell in our bone is called an osteocyte. We know osteo just means bone. And again, remember, when we're dealing with hard tissues like cartilage and bone, the cells are always found in lacunae. Now, one thing that's really different about our bone is that bone has a fabulous blood supply. It's very vascular. And bone does a great job of supporting your body. It's a framework. It protects vital organs like your brain, your spinal cord, your lungs, your heart. They're all protected by bone. It's also storing things, like I mentioned, like calcium. Other minerals, even fat, can be stored inside our bone. And another big function of your bone is that your bones are actually hollow on the inside. The fact that they're hollow makes it easier for you to lug them around, right? It makes them less heavy, but it also gives your body a place to store things. And typically what we store in the hollow spaces of our bones is red bone marrow. And red bone marrow is where we make our blood cells. So this is a site of hematopoiesis. That term hematopoiesis just means blood cell formation. Okay, so inside our bones, we have red bone marrow, and red bone marrow is where we make our blood cells. That's where we go through hematopoiesis. I think bone is probably one of the easiest connective tissues to identify, bone and blood. Bone, I think, is really easy. If you look at bone under the microscope, to me, it looks like tree rings. So you see the little rings in there. So I'm going to point a couple things out to you. One is this big black circle in the center of those rings. Now this one's not black, but it should be. That big black circle, that is not a cell. That is not an osteocyte. That is a canal for blood vessels to run through. So we call that the central canal. So this is a great example showing you under a microscope how vascular your bone actually is. Has a fabulous blood supply. And then all these little tiny black structures that go around those rings, those are our osteocytes in lacuna. Okay. And then our last connective tissue, so we've done connective tissue propers, we've done our 3 kinds of cartilage, we've done bone, and now our last one is blood. Blood, remember I mentioned this on Monday, it is a very atypical connective tissue. It doesn't really connect or give support. Now, this is what your book says. I would argue that blood is a great connective tissue because it connects everything together. But remember, the reason why we classify blood as a connective tissue is because it develops from the same embryonic tissue as our other connective tissues. Remember, it's that middle layer in that big ball of embryonic cells called mesenchyme. Now, because blood is atypical, it is not going to follow all the same rules of our other connective tissues. Meaning, as we've gone through our connective tissues, I tell you what kind of fiber, what kind of cell, right? In terms of fibers, blood has fibers in it, but you don't see them unless your blood is clotting. So these are soluble proteins that you never even see. And the only time you see them is when you start going through the reaction of blood clotting. The type of cell, again, remember, this is very atypical. So our cell type is basically red and white blood cells. So remember, they don't follow the blast site rule, the immature and mature cell rule. Instead, we have hematopoietic stem cells and then mature blood cells. Okay, so we have blood cells that are found in plasma. All of your blood is found inside vessels, so your blood is not just free in your body, it's always housed in your blood vessels. And the function of your blood is to basically transport gases like oxygen and CO2, transport nutrients, and then get rid of wastes, transport wastes. So this is an image of blood under a microscope. So a couple things I'm going to point out. All the white space that you see is plasma. That's just our liquid that the cells float in. The majority of the cell type that you have in your blood is called they're red blood cells. Another term for a red blood cell is, I don't know why my pen's being all crazy. Let's see if I can. Here we go. An erythrocyte is a red blood cell. And then we also have in our blood white blood cells. White blood cells make up less than 1% of your blood volume. The white blood cells are huge. So here are 2 white blood cells. And a lot of times for a white blood cell, I'll just abbreviate it WBC for white blood cell. And we also can call them, leukocytes. Okay, so a white blood cell or a leukocyte, or a red blood cell I'll call RBC, or an erythrocyte. Okay. Now this slide is giving you specific names of white blood cells. So we have things like monocytes, neutrophils, lymphocytes. You don't have to know specific white blood cell names. The general name for a white blood cell is a white blood cell or a leukocyte. That's just the very generic terms. Okay. Again, The majority of your blood, about 45% of your blood volume is red blood cells. Remember, these are going to be carrying oxygen. That's their main job. Less than 1% is white blood cells. White blood cells fight infections. So I mentioned to you, I'm going to skip back real quick because I showed you at the start of our connective tissues, I showed you this image. This is an image that is from, I think it's 2 editions removed from your book. I like this image. I walked you through this. I think this is a great study tool. You can see how everything develops from mesenchyme, all the different types of cells depending on the 4 different kinds of connective tissues we're looking at. And then you can see all the subclasses, right? Our 3 kinds of cartilage, our different kinds of connective tissue proper. We've got our bone and our blood. Your new edition for your book, the image is, if you're looking at your book and studying, the image is this one. It's essentially the same thing. It's just less flowcharty. So you can see your 4 kinds of connective tissue here. And then you can see the subclasses for each of those, the type of cells and the matrix. So either one that you want to study from is fine. I think what I don't like about this is that it's left off the whole mesenchyme aspect, right? They all come from mesenchyme. But they're essentially the same thing, those 2 images. So we have done epithelial tissue. We have walked through all of our connective tissues. We only have 2 tissues left, nervous tissue and muscle tissue. Is everybody okay with our connective tissues? 4 different kinds.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so the next tissue, our 3rd tissue we're going to go over is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is a type of tissue that makes up the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves that run throughout your body. We call them peripheral nerves. They might run down your arms or down your legs. The main function of your nervous tissue is regulation and control. It regulates and controls your body's functions. So things like movement, even breathing and your heart rate are regulated by things like nervous impulses. Now, in our nervous tissue, there's 2 kinds of cells. One type of cell is called a neuron. Hang on, I'm gonna get this. There we go. Neurons are special cells. They're specialized, and their job is that they send the impulses. So they have a membrane potential, and they have the ability to conduct an electrical impulse. So these are very special cells. Neurons, to me, under a microscope, look kind of like smushed bugs. So they sort of have these branchy processes. They do have a nucleus. They have these small branchy processes and one really long process, typically. Now, the other kind of cell that we have the other kind of cell that we have are called neuroglia. Sometimes we also call these glial cells. Okay, it's the same thing. Neuroglia are not conducting cells. They do not conduct electrical impulses. They do not send signals. They are not there for your brain to communicate with area of your body or vice versa. They send no motor impulses. They get no sensory impulses. That's not their job. They are non-conducting cells. The job of neuroglia is simply to support. They are there to support your neurons. They make sure that neurons stay healthy. They make sure that neurons have a blood supply. They insulate neurons, but they do not send signals. These are actually so important that about half the mass of your brain is made of these supporting neuroglia. So that's huge. What we typically see is that for one neuron, you'll have 10 neuroglia around it supporting it. Okay, so even though they're not sending signals, they're still really important in your nervous tissue. So this is an image from the brain of your nervous tissue. And so you can see things like these big cells that look like smushed bugs under here with these long processes. Those are our neurons. And then, I don't know if y'all can see these teeny tiny little dots in the background. Those are the nuclei of the neuroglia. Those are our supporting cells. Okay. All right, the last kind of tissue that we're going to do in chapter 4 is muscle tissue. We have 3 kinds of muscle that we'll walk through. First, I want to tell you a little bit about muscle. One is that it's very cellular. There are a ton of cells in your muscle tissue. It has a fabulous blood supply. And the job of muscle is that it contracts, so it provides some type of movement. Whether we're talking about movement you can see on the outside or movement on the inside, like your heart is helping to move blood, or your smooth muscle, which lines your hollow organs, is helping to propel substances through the inside of your body. So we have 3 kinds that we'll walk through: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. So skeletal muscle is the one we're going to start with. Skeletal muscle, under a microscope, the cells are really long. So they're these super long cells. They can be up to 1 meter in length. The cells have, each skeletal muscle cell is multinucleated. I'm going to star that. You are going to see that on an exam. There will be a question about which type of muscle tissue is multinucleate. The only one is skeletal muscle. And the other thing is, when you look at skeletal muscle under a microscope, you see these little striations. So where do we find skeletal muscle? Attached to the skeleton. Okay, so it is attached to your skeleton. It uses your bones as levers, and it pulls on those bones to provide movement. And the big function of your skeletal muscle is that it's controlling voluntary movement. It is the only type of muscle that is under voluntary control, meaning your brain can tell your skeletal muscle to move and contract. So I can say, hey, I want to pick up my drink and take a drink. My brain has told my skeletal muscles to do that. It's voluntary. This is skeletal muscle under a microscope. And what we're looking at, so you can see like right here, just circled it, that would be one skeletal muscle cell. It is so long, it's running off the field of view of the microscope. So these cells are really, really long. The other thing you're going to notice are all these nuclei within that one cell. So again, it's multinucleate. And then the last thing you'll notice is all these striations, these little bands in there. Now notice I told you that your muscle is very cellular. So you can see that it is one muscle cell next to another, next to another, next to another. They're very parallel with each other. Now cardiac muscle, to me, looks kind of similar to skeletal muscle in that it's still striated, right? It still has these little striations, but it has a couple of differences that make it really easy to identify. One is that instead of the cells being all parallel, you'll see a little more branching where the cell will kind of branch off. The other is that it is not multinucleate. It is uninucleate. The only multinucleated muscle cells are skeletal muscles. And then the last one, and this is the big one, this is the one that I think helps you identify cardiac muscle the best. And that is that it has something called an intercalated disc. These are discs between the cells that allow your cardiac muscle cells to communicate with each other, and it allows the cells to contract as a whole unit. That's really important because if your cardiac muscle cells are not contracting as a unit so that the whole area of the heart can contract and propel blood, what you get in your heart is something called fibrillation. And it's where the heart muscle looks like it's quivering. And it's all those cells are contracting all alone by themselves. You pump no blood when that happens. The heart is not effective at moving blood when it's fibrillating. This is why if you've ever watched like Grey's Anatomy, or if you've ever taken a CPR class, we have things called external automatic defibrillators. And these are things where, you know, the paddles where they rub them together and they say clear and then they shock the patient. They are defibrillating the patient. They are getting that patient out of fibrillation. They want the cells to start contracting in unison again so you can start moving blood. So these intercalated discs are really important in getting your heart cells to contract together. So where do we find your cardiac muscle? We find it in the heart, right? It's in the walls of the heart, and its job is to move blood through your body. It generates a blood pressure, so it truly helps to get that blood circulating through the entire body. And again, it is involuntary. You know, thank goodness we do not have to remember to make our heart contract and beat. I have too many things already that I'm thinking about. I can't remember that. So that is involuntary. This is an image of cardiac muscle under the microscope. And so again, what you're gonna notice in terms of similarities with skeletal muscle is you have these little striations in here. But to me, the distinguishing characteristic are these bands, these intercalated discs. Another thing that you might notice is you might notice that you don't see a lot of nuclei, right? It's not multinucleate, it's a uninucleate. So you see a few nuclei kind of scattered around, but not a bunch. And then you also see a lot of branching. So instead of having this nice long cell, you'll see the cells branch. Now our last type of muscle is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle gets its name because it's very smooth in appearance. It has no striations. And the cells look different. To me, the cells of smooth muscle are spindle-shaped, and they have a central nucleus. So these are also uninucleate. Where we find this type of muscle is our hollow organs. So in the GI tract, like in the intestines, you find it in the stomach, find it in the esophagus, you find it in the urinary tract, propelling urine. You find it in the uterus, helping to either deliver a baby or shed the uterine lining. And the function truly is just to propel substances along that internal passageway. That process has a name. It's called peristalsis. This is the process of propelling substances along an internal passageway. And just like cardiac muscle, you know, it's involuntary. So again, you know, if you think about eating your breakfast this morning, and you know, you have your bowl of Cheerios and you chew them using skeletal muscle, that's voluntary. You swallow using skeletal muscle, it's voluntary. And then you don't think about them again until they come out the other end, where you have skeletal muscle around the anal canal. So all the way propelling through your body, it's all smooth muscle. You're not thinking about it. So this is an image, this is of the GI tract, looking at that smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is really hard to get a good image of under a microscope. And so you can see, I'll kind of draw a line here. So you can see that sort of spindle-shaped cell, right? So that is our smooth muscle. You can see the nuclei right in the middle. Okay, so this is a great picture over here on the left, just kind of showing you those spindle-shaped cells. So those are the 4 tissues that we've walked through, right? So we have gone through, let's see. So we have gone through our epithelial tissue, right, as a covering or a lining. We've gone through all of our connective tissues. So again, remember we have our connective tissue proper, we have our cartilage, we have our bone, we have our blood, right? All of these come from mesenchyme. We have nervous tissue. And we have our muscle. And we have our different kinds of muscle. We have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So on an exam, I will ask you general characteristic questions about the tissues. It'll be questions like, which of the following types of muscle tissue is multinucleate, right? And you would tell me that's skeletal muscle. Or I might ask you a question where I would say, which of the following types of tissues has chondrocytes and elastic fibers? Well, you know chondrocytes are in cartilage, and of our 3 kinds of cartilage, the one with a lot of elastic fibers is elastic cartilage. So I'll give you characteristic questions. It'll be multiple choice questions. I am not going to put a lot of images on the lecture exam for your tissues. You will get images on a lab exam. So this week in lab, your lab PDF document for chapter 4 that you're completing has images from all the different kinds of tissues that you have to be able to identify. So on a lab exam, I'll have one of those images from that lab PDF document that will be up, and I'll say, identify this tissue, okay? And so where I'm gonna have you do more visual identification will be on the lab portion. Where I'm gonna be asking you a little bit more about the structures and the characteristics of these tissues will be on the lecture portion. All right, let's flip back over. Y'all have any questions?
No.
Okay.
Nope.
All right, so the last couple things in chapter 4, still on tissues, just kind of walks through our membranes. Hey, Elena?
Yes.
Do you have a question, or are you okay?
No, I'm okay.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you to mute. And the only reason I'm doing that is because if you're not on mute, when people come back and try to watch the recording, they'll just see your pretty picture on the screen, which you may not want. All right. So the last couple of slides that we're going to walk through are just on membranes. So in terms of the membranes are things that we might find inside or outside of the body. And a membrane has more than one type of tissue. So they're actually considered organs. In order for it to be an organ, it has to have at least 2 tissues. And so there's 3 kinds of membranes that we're going to walk through. One is the cutaneous membrane. Does that sound familiar to anybody? The term cutaneous? What's it mean?
Skin.
Yes, ma'am. It just means your skin. So your skin is considered a membrane. It is an organ. We also have mucous membranes, right? Mucous membranes are moist membranes. And a lot of times these are membranes that we'll find sort of in the openings of our body. So like your mouth is a mucous membrane. The nasal cavity has a mucous membrane. The urogenital tract has that mucous membrane. It's openings to the inside. And then lastly are our serous membranes, which we have already talked about those in chapter 1. These are membranes that we find in our closed body cavities. So we'll start with our cutaneous membrane, right? This is, Andrea said this is our skin. And there are 2 tissues that are in your cutaneous membrane, right? A membrane has to have 2 different tissues. The one on the surface, again, think of your skin, a covering or a lining. So we know it's epithelial tissue. The type of epithelial tissue, remember we have different kinds, simple or stratified. Think of the functions. Simple epithelium is always involved in absorption, secretion, and filtration. Stratified epithelium is there for protection. It's nice and thick. So the first layer of your skin, your cutaneous membrane, is a stratified squamous epithelial tissue. It's nice and thick. It's there for protection. Just under that, you have a dense, irregular connective tissue. Again, let's think about this one. This is the one where you have a lot of collagen fibers arranged irregularly. So it can withstand tension in lots of different, there we go. From different directions. Okay, so a dense irregular connective tissue right underneath that stratified squamous epithelium means that now your skin can withstand a lot of tension from different directions. Again, remember, we put too much tension on it and that second layer can tear. We see it as stretch marks. We're going to talk way more about the skin in chapter 5. So we'll talk more about things like stretch marks and burns and things that can affect your skin. Another kind of membrane are our mucous membranes. Another term for that are mucosa. Now here's another example of where if it ends in A, to make it plural, we add the E on the end. Right? That makes it plural. And your mucous membranes are going to line your cavities that are open to the outside. So again, I mentioned the digestive, the respiratory cavity, the urogenital tracts. These are moist membranes, so they're usually wet. And the 2 tissues that we find are stratified epithelium, right? Again, think about the lining of your mouth, right? I think I told you all on Monday that my child is really into some Captain Crunch right now, which to me that stuff will tear your mouth up. So this is there for protection. Protection from abrasion, protection from wear and tear. So in the mouth, in the nose, in the urogenital tract. You want a nice thick tissue. And then just under that is a loose connective tissue. A lot of times the type of loose connective tissue is areolar connective tissue. I'm going to flip back. Close your eyes. I don't want to give anybody a seizure. I'm moving real fast. I'm going to flip back just to an image of areolar so you can see it. This is a lot of times in the second layer of our mucous membranes. And the reason is, remember, this is a loose connective tissue. It's very spread out, has a lot of collagen fibers, has elastic fibers, can retain a lot of fluid. But the kind of cell that we find in here a lot of times is not just our fibroblasts, because that's our connective tissue proper cell, but also white blood cells, macrophages, mast cells. So a big function of this tissue is immunity. So this tissue, because it's a loose tissue, you've got white blood cells. Remember, their job is to fight infection. Because this is really spread out, white blood cells can literally move through this tissue. They can patrol the area and they can look for any kind of foreign organism that may have gotten in. Now think about that and how important that is when we're talking about an opening into our body, right? Our mouth, our nose, our urogenital tract. We want the first tissue to be nice and thick for protection. And then just underneath that, we want areolar connective tissue because we want our immune system cells right there, just in case we get a tear or we get a foreign organism that has made its way through that top tissue. All right, so the last kind of membrane are our serous membranes. And remember, we can call these serosa. Again, here's that E example. Okay, again, making it plural. And these are going to be membranes that are in our closed body cavities. So you all did these in lab last week for your chapter 1 lab, where you looked at things like the ventral body cavities and the dorsal body cavities, and the serous membranes around those. And there are 2 tissues in your serous membranes. The outermost tissue is a simple epithelium. Notice every one of these has been epithelial tissue because it is a covering or a lining. So we have a simple epithelium here. It's not stratified. And the reason is that your serous membranes need a simple epithelium so that you can reduce friction. You don't want a lot of friction around your organs that are moving and within those tight body cavities. So a simple epithelium is absorption, secretion, filtration, but also because it's so thin, it really is a very slick lining. So it's great at reducing friction. And then there's also a loose connective tissue under that. And again, it's typically something like areolar. Right, it has those white blood cells in it. Now there's 2 types. So remember, we have our parietal serosa or our visceral serosa. Parietal means that it lines the cavity. The term visceral actually just means organ. So visceral serosa are the ones that sit on top of the organs. And then we give them a name associated with the organ or cavity that it's part of. So we have a parietal and visceral pleura around the lungs, parietal and visceral pericardium around the heart, and parietal and visceral peritoneum in the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay, so this is a great picture showing you each of those. All right, so that is it for our chapter 4. All of our tissues, we talked a little bit about membranes. I know this outline says tissue repair. I've moved that into chapter 5, where we do skin. We'll talk about what happens if you cut your skin and how your skin can go about repairing itself. It's the same process, okay? So we don't do tissue repair in chapter 4. We're gonna save it for the next chapter. Your chapter 4 lab PDF, now that we've gone through chapter 4, I would say now you can go on, and as long as you're familiar with your tissue types, now you can probably go in and do that lab PDF. You might be a little more confident doing that now. I also want to mention, I feel like we just started, we did, but you do have a lecture exam that's coming up. Your first lecture exam will cover chapters 1, 4, and 5. We're going to be doing chapter 5 next week. So I will be posting an announcement giving you a little more information about this very first lecture exam. Again, you'll be taking it through Canvas. You'll be using that honor lock, which you all have had a chance to try out with that syllabus quiz. So I'll give you a little more information about that exam in Canvas in the next couple of days, just so you kind of know what to expect. Does anybody have any questions?
Nope.
Everybody okay? So I don't, do you all like having live lectures? Do you feel like it keeps you on task?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Because they don't have many people that are attending. And so I have recordings of every single chapter that I can post if you would prefer to just watch a recording. But that's up to you guys. As long as you keep coming, I'll keep doing them.
Hey, where do we go again to watch the recordings? Just so I can like rewatch it. So
Yeah, here.
you know,
Yeah, of course. Let me show you. Let's see. Go home. So you can watch them in a couple of different places, but so let's see. We're in chapter 4 here. So right here where it says lecture material, here's the lecture recordings, and I say right here media gallery. So if you click on this, it'll take you to the media gallery, but you can also get there. I scroll back up. See all these tabs over here? Here's the media gallery. So you should see that as well. So you can get to it either directly from the module or over here. And when you go to the media gallery, just kidding. It's going to take a really long time. I don't know what it's doing. I think it's still thinking. All right, let's go back and try through the module. I think it's going to do the same thing. Okay, new window. I know I got an email that they pushed an update yesterday, so I don't know if that might be affecting this. We've had so many issues with this media gallery. Well, that's normally where you would find them. I will reach out to IT since I'm on campus. It'll be easier and just tell them for some reason I'm not able to open this. I just opened it yesterday. Has anybody else been able to not get in? Have you all tried to go back and watch recordings?
Yes.
You were able to?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so they just pushed an update yesterday, so I'm wondering if that has affected something. But that's where you would normally go, is right there. If we keep having issues, I may end up, I have a YouTube channel and I may just upload all of these Zoom recordings to YouTube. I feel like YouTube never has any problems, whereas this media gallery is always crashing and always having issues. So if I keep having issues with it, that's probably what I'll do. And I'll just give you the link to my YouTube channel, okay? Any other questions that y'all can think about?
What was the lecture test 1 on again? Was it chapters 1, 4, and 5?
It'll be 1, 4, and 5.
Okay, thank you.
And then, like I said, I will post an announcement later this week that just kind of walks you through sort of what to expect, how many questions you'll see on the exam. It will be mostly multiple choice, and that's the case for all of your lecture exams. They're mostly multiple choice exams. There might be a few art labeling questions, and the art will be something that we did in the PowerPoint lecture. So it will be something that's pulled from your textbook that you're familiar with.
Okay, thank you.
But I'll tell you about how many questions it'll be, and I'll give you all those details in an announcement.
all right, that's good to know.
All right, anything else? Any other questions? Yeah.
Will you give us a study guide?
So these PowerPoints, I will tell you that I made these PowerPoints by reading. I read your chapter. I have read this whole book cover to cover. And as I made the PowerPoints, I would read the chapter and I would add into the PowerPoint what I thought not only was important, but what I wanted to talk about to you. So these PowerPoints, they are your study guide. If it is in the PowerPoint, if it is something that I talked about in the lecture, then it's fair game for the exam. I did study guides one semester and grades went way down when I did study guides. So I just find it better if I tell you use the PowerPoint as your study guide. Make sure that you know the information on the PowerPoint and you will do just fine. Any other questions y'all can think of?
I don't have a question. I'm just gonna let you know that I won't be able to be available for the next lab because I have something extremely important on Monday to do.
Okay, so you won't be here when we do our next live Zoom?
Yeah.
Okay, that's okay. Thanks for letting me know. Hopefully the media gallery is working and you'll be able to watch the recording. Like I said, I'll let IT know that there's an issue with it today, and hopefully it'll get corrected. But all these recordings I have, if it's not corrected today, I'll either give you a link to the Zoom recording from today, or I'll give you a link into my YouTube channel. Okay, so you'll have today's either way. I always record these and they're always posted, so you can always go back and watch them. All right, well, I will see you all, except Michael, I will see all the rest of you on Monday, hopefully. Let me know if you have any questions as you're working through your Chapter 4 mastering assignments and your lab PDF.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.